Hello beautiful souls and welcome back, and if you're new, thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button to become part of our growing spiritual community, especially because today's video is actually a request from one of you guys, so thank you so much for your request. I'm really excited to do this video today. We are going to be comparing side by side the Moonchild Tarot by Danielle Noel and the Ethereal Alchemist Tarot by Val from Valkyrie Art. So let's get started. So when I saw this request, I was just like, this is the best idea. Why did I not think of this myself? So thank you so much to Lady Moonlight, I believe that's the right handle, who requested this. I think it's a great idea because you may be thinking that these decks are the same, but they are really quite different. So these decks at first glance may seem quite similar to you because they are both using that beautiful graphic design collage mixed media that I love. However, they actually are quite different. The energy is different, the color palette is different. Obviously they're both tarot decks, so they are going to both have the kind of symbols and signs that you would expect to see in certain cards, but of course they are two different women, so they will have interpreted things differently, brought their own energy into things. It was such a great request because I was like, I've never really thought about the difference, but I've just been organizing them into order to do the filming for you guys, and I was like, wait a minute, they're really different. So yeah, a great request. Thank you for this. If you guys do have any requests, please reach out to me, pop a comment below, because I love hearing what you're interested in seeing. It's so fascinating and it's so cool to work together in this community. These are two of my favorite decks. I'm not even joking. These, Gentle Heart Tarot, White Newman Tarot. I'm sure there's something else I've forgotten there because you guys know me, but I'm a Libran, so I can never decide. So So we're going to go through the boxes, we're going to go through the guidebooks, we're going to go through the major and the minor arcana side by side to have a look to see the differences. So if you're trying to decide which deck to get, then honestly the answer at the end of this is probably going to be both. Just do one a year, honestly, like have an investment, one a year. This one's quite soft, quite muted. This one's more vibrant. Everything is of course timestamped below to make everything easy for you. If you've managed to watch me talk for this long, then I'm so proud of you. Thank you so much. I'm always like, I'm not going to talk too much, and then I get excited and I can't stop talking. So let's just dive in. We're going to start with the boxes. So the Moonchild Tarot has quite an antique age design, whereas the Ethereal Alchemist is quite modern, and yet the back layout is quite similar on both of them. And then inside the boxes you have these beautiful designs which are either really detailed or really simple but effective, and I just love the inside of both of these boxes actually, and these mantras or affirmations as well. I just think the details in both of these has just been really well thought out, and the colours are absolutely beautiful. So I also wanted to show you the back of both of the decks and the differences there, because they are very different on the back. And I wanted to show you also both the antique gold edges on the decks are very different as well. You can see the Moonchild is a little bit darker, whereas the Ethereal Alchemist is quite a bright colour. And I also wanted to show you here that the Ethereal Alchemist is a little bit wider than the Moonchild, and the Moonchild is just a tiny bit taller there. Okay, now let's take a look at the guidebooks and see the differences, because they are both in colour, but the way that they're laid out is slightly different, and some of the card spreads and the intentions and the other spiritual knowledge that the authors have brought in is slightly different as well. So as you can see, both the guidebooks are really quite chunky. There's a lot of information included in both of them. Again, the Ethereal Alchemist is just a tiny bit bigger, but they both have a lot of detail within. There's a lot of spiritual knowledge that's shared, and the actual feel of the book itself is very similar on both of them. I would just say it's actually a little bit easier to turn the pages of the Ethereal Alchemist. As you can see, they're nice smooth waxy pages, so beautiful designs. The contents page is great because it's got everything you need to know and all the extra details in here, which I love. There's so much information included in here, and you know, obviously they go through all the different types of the cards, but they include all the extra things. So you can see that in this one, for example, she has included information on the chakras, and then she's gone into all the different spreads, but each of the decks has a light and a shadow element rather than upright and reversed. And I really like that actually, because sometimes even if a card is reversed, you might still feel that you're connected to the light, whereas sometimes you might feel actually it's upright but the shadow is more appropriate for me. So it's quite great actually that you can just tune into your intuition with this one, but there is so much information in here, and it's really great for just really tuning into the deck and understanding, you know, what astrology sign is it connected to, or what element is it connected to, and then obviously there's a bit about Val. Whereas this one, obviously you can see, at first I did actually struggle to turn these pages a bit for you. I had to edit a bit there. Again, great contents page, loads of information, and I think really the contents page is a bit smaller here because there's a lot of information in each of the sections. A lot about the moon, of course, because this deck is the Moonchild deck, so information about the different types of moons that you can experience and goddesses and things. Like, it's a really cool, just an interesting read, actually, to be honest. There's loads of really good information in here, and you can see she's included a history of tarot. So I think Danielle's really great for getting all of the details in, which I really love. And then obviously she also talks about the physical, mental and spiritual planes, which I really like that she included that as well. And all of the different information about all of the suits, and you know, the page, the knight, the king, the queen, and even a moon bath ritual, which I think is a really lovely thing to include as well. There you go, there's the pages to do with the new, the full, the crescent moons. Just so much information is included. And then it goes through the major arcana, and in each of this she includes a little description of the card, and then just some different information and some things that you can ask yourself before going into the upright and reversed meanings, which I like. So you can kind of interpret the card, or you can read her interpretations for upright and reversed. And again, there's some keywords and things included, which is really nice. And she has included some extra cards which we will go through shortly, and those cards also have all their interpretations, which are just so beautiful. Lots of journaling, lots of, you know, inspiration and things to keep you going, and just really detailed. Again, like, you know, it's really easy to use this guidebook if you're trying to give yourself or someone else a reading, if you're new to tarot, or if you just want to double check a meaning. Yeah, there's definitely both of them have just so much information you can enjoy. So let's go through the major arcana of each deck. Okay, so the first major difference is that the number and the title of the card on the Ethereal Alchemist is always on the bottom, whereas on the Moonchild Tarot, the title is at the bottom and the number is actually at the top. So those are the main differences, but as you can see here, the Fool in the Ethereal is just really about surrender and trust, whereas I feel like the Fool in the Moonchild is more of like caution, being careful, letting something else like your familiar go ahead before you to kind of test the waters, to check for you that it's safe to go ahead. So the main difference here is obviously the title of the alchemist rather than the magician, but also the colours, the backgrounds, the energies feel very different and yet still very magical for this card. This is one of my favourite cards from both decks, and I think both of them have to have quite similar symbology because the High Priestess is such an important card. There's so many key points you need to get across, so obviously the major arcana is a little bit more similar. Now the vibe is quite different in this one. One of them feels quite ancient and yet one of them feels very earthy, and I just really love how the different colours are in here and yet they're both really still connected to that feminine, Mother Earth, ancient energy. They're both gorgeous cards but really feel quite different to me. Very different vibes here. One of them feels like he's fallen over, he's exhausted, he can't take anymore, but the other one feels very grounded, very sorted, very ready to take on the next challenge, like I've been through it and I know exactly who I am and what I'm here to do. Love both of these cards as well. Yes, they have similar colours in them, but their energy is very different. Look at how one of them's got a cloak on, is shrouded, is going within. The other one is reaching up, ready to receive from the divine. There's very different energy in these, even though the colours are very similar, and I think they're lovely. Quite similar artwork in these cards, and yet at the same time, very different focus. One of them feels to me like just focus on your relationship and the two of you, whereas the other one feels like it's okay to be out there, to put yourself out into the world as a couple, you know, it's safe to be seen. So I think these cards are very different actually energetically. Very different cards here. One of them feels very wild, very out there, very Sagittarius energy actually, and the other one feels very methodical, very planned, very considered, which feels really Virgo to me. So I feel like the energy of these cards is very different, and I think you would read them very differently if you were reading for these. Very interesting card here. One of them is very submissive, the lion's head's down, its eyes are closed, whereas the other one is sitting tall, it's sitting proud. Again, very different energies for these cards. So I think you would definitely be reading these quite differently, which I find fascinating. This is one of my favorite cards from the Ethereal Alchemist. I love the Hermit, and I think the colors in this are beautiful, and it kind of feels like the space before the Hermit, before you go into the cave, or before you go within you're getting ready to go into that space. Whereas the Moonchild Tarot feels very much like you're in that space. You're deep within the realms of your heart or your soul. You're really tuning into yourself. So again, these are very different cards, very different energies, very different color tones. I think it's really fascinating how both have interpreted this. Something I find interesting about these is that the Ethereal Alchemist feels very masculine on the left, and it feels very connected to like the Divine Masculine, Archangel Michael, protection, that kind of thing. Whereas on the right, it feels a bit softer, a bit more balanced maybe, and I find it really interesting how they've interpreted these. So this is actually the card that made me buy the Ethereal Alchemist Tarot. The colours are stunning. I love the Justice card here. Really beautiful. She's got her head down, she's poised, she's contemplating things, whereas in the Moonchild Tarot, she's got it raised, she's ready to take action. You know, she's very vulnerable because she's obviously half undressed, but there is this sense of like, well, nothing can hurt me because justice will come, justice will prevail, even though I am currently nude. So these cards are very different because the Hanged Woman doesn't really feel like she's hanged. She feels like whether she's reversed or upright, you could really choose to read into what that would interpret for you. Whereas the Hanged Man feels very definite, very much suspended, or taking that, you know, introspection and that different perspective. So I think these are very different cards. There's obviously a lot more detail to the Hanged Man, so there'd be a lot more scope for interpretation. I think that would potentially make it easier to read. Two very beautiful cards. I actually think they've almost brought beauty into the element of death, which is something interesting to achieve or to attain when you're going through that space of death and rebirth, that cycle. And obviously there's the snake and all these different symbolic meanings and nature. It's, I think, really interesting. It talks really to me about the cycles of life and the cycles of Mother Earth, like the seasons and things like that, not just the element of something is dead or dying. These are definitely very different cards. One of them feels to me like you're inside or you're within yourself trying to find balance. The other one feels as though you've attained that balance and you're able to take that out into the world, into your life. And yet we have such a contrast here. So we have the ego with the Ethereal Alchemist Tarot. I really like this card actually, and it's interesting to me because it really talks about how temptation really stems from the ego rather than the soul. Whereas obviously with the Moonchild Tarot, we've got more of this classic temptation, the devil energy to this card. So again, I really love how they've both interpreted it. These cards look similar at first, but when you look closer, the energy's different. There's a lot more destruction going on with the Ethereal Alchemist, with the dragons and the lightning, whereas with the other one, I feel like there's almost, it's over, it's happened, the destruction's happened, things are falling, and you are now falling to rock bottom. That's what that feels like. You are about to reach rock bottom with this one, whereas the other one feels like there's a lot of external stuff going on. These are very different cards, aren't they? The energy is different. One of them is immersed in the water, connecting to the earth, allowing it to wash over them. The other one is in control of the water, pouring it while still standing or kneeling in it and feeling connected to it. So these cards are both really beautiful, but very different symbolically and interpretation wise. Oh, I find this card very different. One of them is like, no one else is around, it's just you. Have a look at what's going on within you, connect and release those illusions that the moon is releasing and showing you. Whereas another one is that classic symbology, the interpretation, the balance, the subconscious quality. I find them interesting. The sun, I feel so much joy looking at the Moonchild Tarot here. Just they look so relaxed, so surrendered. And yet the other one I feel is very sensual. There's this real sensual connection here, this ability to tune into that solar plexus sacral chakra type of energy and really express that. I love the differences here. I love both of these cards. Look at the colours, look at the details, look at the design. Absolutely stunning. The first one with the Ethereal Alchemist feels to me like something's looking down on you and judging you, whereas the other one feels like you are that kind of equal, almost being judged for what you have received or done or shared, right? And the energy's there a little bit different, but at the same time, it needs to be the same. So both of the authors here went for the universe, just spelled slightly differently, and there's a very mystical, otherworldly quality, which is so interesting because obviously it's nothing really to do with the world. And I feel a lot of positive energy from both of these cards. I feel as though if they came up in a reading, even if they were reversed or I was looking at the shadow, I would definitely think that there was something positive coming, a switch or a change that was happening that was positive for that person. Okay, so we have the extra cards in the Moonchild Tarot. We have shadow work, Then we have the Moonchild card, which you kind of can't really do a Moonchild Tarot without including a Moonchild card, really, can you? And then we have the Divine Wisdom, which this is the card that made me choose the Moonchild Tarot. I think it's such a beautiful card. I love the energy, I love the meaning, I love the colours, I love the symbology. So those are the 3 extra cards you get. All right, now that we've looked at the major arcana, let's go through the minor arcana, and we're going to go through each card. So I will timestamp each of the suits below so that you can skip ahead to a suit if you already know one of them really well, or if you're really keen to see all of the cards, I would just say just watch them through. So of course there are going to be a lot of similarities with some of the smaller suits as well. Obviously, where there are certain symbols that you would want to include in a deck for interpretation reasons, but obviously the color palette or the style or the design is really quite different in some of the cards, and yet other cards have similar-ish connections or energies. And again, I would look to that. If these were oracle decks, I'd expect them to be very different, but because they're both tarot, I do expect to see some similarities here. So obviously we have the cups that we're going through. You can see that very small figure there, and the cups to me are very different in both of these. Some of them feel more positive, some of them feel, you know, more challenging, and I think it's really interesting the color palettes that they both used. Obviously cups, you're thinking water, but even then there's still that, you know, ethereal quality to both of them. And as you can see here, the 7 of Cups, same kind of idea that's come through, just a different interpretation of the colors and the meaning for that. And then that tiny figure, you can just see there. So they've really taken their own intentions and interpretations, I think, for this. I mean, we're coming up to the 10 of Cups, which I actually think is interesting how very different it is. You know, in the Ethereal Alchemist, it's just one person and there's a lot of joy and abundance for them, whereas they're sharing that joy and abundance in the Moonchild Tarot. So yeah, really interesting how differently they've both worked with these. You know, like here, the Page of Cups feels a bit darker in the Ethereal Alchemist, whereas in the Moonchild it feels really light and bright. So really interesting to me, the colours that they've used, the designs, the way that they've really thought about how they're going to show what this is. Now I do find the Queens a little harder to interpret in the Ethereal Alchemist because there's a lot less detail. I think you'd need to know the decks a little bit more, or at least the cards and the suits a bit more. It's same with the Kings, because I don't know them that much and I'd find it harder to interpret them, whereas the King and the Queen in the Moonchild Tarot, as you can see, has a lot more detail. I really love the way that the Ethereal Alchemist presents the wands with the beautiful flowers and the colours that are included in this. Again, you will have some similarities because obviously you need to be able to interpret them, but at the same time, some of the colours are different, some of the intentions are different. Like this one's very, very different to me. I feel like you'd interpret this very differently if you were giving yourself or someone else a reading. Whereas this one, there is that same connection, you know, reaching out, connecting. It feels very sisterly or very loving, which is really nice. So there are some similarities, of course, but again, there's enough differences that if you're trying to choose between these 2 decks, that you can get both of them, because again, the interpretation scope is just so different for both of them. I mean, like, look at how different this one is. It's so different with the roses and yet the sand, like, very contrasting. I don't know the minor arcana very well, so these are really helpful to me to really take in the differences to actually improve in my skills of reading. I mean, look at how different this one is than both of them. One of them is just straight into the ones with those beautiful roses, whereas the other one is really leading you down this journey, down this path. So there's real differences here, and I think in a way, if you're trying to teach yourself tarot, like getting 2 decks like this is such a good idea, because one of them is insanely detailed with loads of symbology, and the other one has the symbols, has the detail, but also leaves scope for you to connect your intuition and to really try and see what comes up when you tune into that card. Love this card so much in the Ethereal Alchemist again, love the colours, whereas I feel a bit less of a connection to the one in the Moonchild. Something else that I really noticed is in the Knights, the Pages, the Kings, the Queens, there's a real difference in terms of which direction they're facing with their heads, or, you know, I mean, like, yes, this one is not a good example. They're facing the same way. However, on the whole, they are really often quite different. You know, like if you take the King here, for example, one of them's looking almost just off to the side, whereas the other one is completely turned. And again, when you're interpreting, that just brings such a different vibe. I think the Pentacles have a similar-ish vibe here because I think both decks have really gone for this ancient golden theme here. So like thinking old coins, that kind of thing. And so some of the cards are similar, but then some are like this are very different. Like look at the crystals, look at the flowers. There's total differences here that you could really get into and interpret. What's interesting is both authors and artists bring in lots of crystals, lots of flowers, lots of ancient Egyptian symbology, and yet the way that they use them is very different. You know, the way that they access and connect to them is different. So pretty much every card, I feel there is at least one difference that you can really tune into when you're giving a reading, or one similarity that really holds that main thread and theme of what tarot is and how it can be, or in some cases ought to be, interpreted depending on, you know, how strictly you want to follow what tarot really is and what each card means. So again, this one is very, very different for me. I feel like I would read this so differently in a reading. One of them just feels very much about the chakras, whereas the other one is like Mother Earth, connecting, grounding, right? So even here, you know, in nature versus being in a temple space, like just so different. And I just find it really interesting how they've both interpreted and connected with this. So I just really feel like if you're going to get these decks, you might as well get both. Honestly, just invest because you will enjoy using them both. Both of them will help you grow as you become better at giving readings, because one of them has those details that you're looking for, this symbology that's quite classic, and the other one just gives you so much more scope for intuition or different interpretations. Like look at how differently these two are facing. The energies of the cards are really different. So you'd have so much fun working with both of these decks and integrating them. I love the Queen of Pentacles from the Moonchild here. She's stunning. Like the colours are gorgeous in that one. Now this is a great example of what I was talking about with the kings facing different ways. You know, one of them is facing to the left, which is feminine. One of them is facing straight ahead, so very different. I love the different energy in these cards. One of them has the sword up, it's like ready to take action, but the other one's kind of putting the sword down, staking its place in the world, ready to take action in a calm way. This is one card that I think is similar in some ways in terms of the landscape, but then really different. Like one's holding them, one's got the swords in the ground. Now this card I would expect to be very similar because it's just a classic, isn't it? Like if the Three of Swords isn't a heart with swords in, then what is the Three of Swords? It's just not a Three of Swords. Just noticing the subtle differences here, like the Moonchild Tarot, she's doing things one at a time, she's got them surrendered in front of her. The other one is like, oh gosh, help me. I really love both of these cards in both of these decks. The colours are beautiful, the design is beautiful, everything about them is stunning, and I know that number 5 isn't great in tarot, but I still really love these cards. Look at how different the energy is in these. One of them's like facing the sun, I've overcome everything, and the other one's like, I can overcome it, I am empowered enough to do this. Then we have this card, which I don't feel much of a connection to either of these actually. I don't think I've ever pulled this card, so maybe that's a good thing. It doesn't look great, it looks like strife. Don't think I've pulled this card either, but I quite like the veil and the Eight of Swords in the Moonchild Tarot. Again, there's that really like otherworldly quality to it. This one to me just feels really heavy in both of them, and the connection to the moon says to me that there's some kind of illusion or something that's hidden that's coming to light. Now this one is interesting. One of them is like she's in agony, she's in pain, it's difficult, whereas the other one feels like a graveyard to me, do you know? And I find that really interesting how they've both brought those interpretations to life. Another very different card. I feel like the Moonchild Tarot to me is calling you to connect with your third eye, whereas the other one is like go within, enter the temple, find out what's in there. And I find that really interesting. I really like both of these cards. Again, you know, the design, the landscape is very different. The intention for them is different, but the colours and everything is just really beautiful. Now this one to me is like Joan of Arc in the Moonchild Tarot, whereas the other one just feels very icy and cold actually, which I find really interesting. As I say, I don't know much about the Queen and the King. And then again, we've got like this ancient warrior versus this quite modern looking man. So really fascinating cards to me. So I hope that you've enjoyed this video. Let me know what your favourite card from each deck is in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in next week's video. And they're both just because they're both beautiful in their own right. Ugh. So we're going to start. So if you're kind of trying to honestly, what I find is actually